I was born in Nigeria. I consider myself a post-colonial child. I also consider myself an Afropolitan. I consider myself an African who is from the metro city. For us as Africans who live in the city, there is a perception of Africa and an image of Africa as rural. Everyone forgets that Africa is both colonial and modern. That's the history of Africa. That's the history of our cities. As a child who was born in Africa, I consider myself a hybrid. Like the city I was born in and the country I was born in. It is a mix of Africa and a mix of the West. African population and African cities will generally triple by 2050, which means that we will no longer be rural cities or rural countrysides. The future of Africa depends on our cities. And the question I will ask you to think about and speculate with me is it possible to change Africa through its cities and through tangible things like fashion and design? Think about this for a minute. What if Africa could create sustainable economy through fashion and design? Really think about that. Global fashion is $1 billion industry. If Africa could be the fashion capital of the world, and African cities create fashion that is both African and both Western. We are, after all, a mix of both. We are hybrids. I grew up with the African Grand Plan, okay? The African Grand Plan was focused on changing Africa, pioneering the cities for the future. What I envision as an African, as an Afropolitan, is that we will change the world through fashion and through design. They may seem tangible, they may also seem focused on luxury, but imagine if 100 million Africans were working in the fashion and design industry, producing African fashion. That is both a mix of old and new. As you picture this as a possibility, imagine 100 million working Africans. Imagine how they will influence their cities 3 times in fold. Remember, African population is predicted at 1 billion. We are almost like China. We're going to have 3 times more people in our cities in the future. Everybody's talking about Africa today. We are the next big thing. But everybody's speculating about Africa and rural Africa. Rural Africa gets its influence from modern Africa. Everything that happens in the city heads to the rural. There is a change that is happening in Africa. We are taking our crafts from the rural areas and bringing them into the modern spaces. I have an idea, and the idea that I'm speculating is that there's a possibility of a new concept and a new aesthetic that is both African and Western. That new aesthetic is about looking at cultural heritage, looking at crafts, looking at design, both from Africa and from the West. That concept is called hybrid modernity. It is a juxtapositioning of both old and new. It's the juxtapositioning of traditional African craft with modern design, modern sequences, It is also looks at what design is about. It is about color, it's about texture, it's about materials. All those things apply both in the West and both in Africa. Some people who are beginning to experiment with this idea and are pushing forth new ideas are the African Fashion Institute based in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is one of the most influential fashion institutes in Africa right now. And it has taken on a mission and a belief that African fashion is about social change, and we're going to use it as a way of communicating with the world. That is the future of Africa. Second, the other institution is a design school based in Accra. Very simple idea. We want to promote and educate young people across the world, whether African, whether European, whether American, about African design. When I first talked to the owner of the school, we talked about the Parsons School of Design of Africa as a mission. Some about the old, some about the new, and some about the in-between. Hybrid modernity offers us an opportunity to speculate, to think about, to imagine the future of Africa. One of the things that I would say is there are designers out there who are beginning to showcase some of that modernity. One of them is Nigerian designer who's based in London, Doru Olowo. He has, over the last 7, 8 years, began to look at fashion that is a bit of a mix of his heritage as a Nigerian, a mix of his heritage as a Jamaican, as well as a mix of his British influence. So you will see in his clothes a little bit of Britain, a little bit of Bohemia, a little bit of Africa. And for me, this is what Africa will become. The second designer is Ghanaian-born Aisha Obubi. She has a brand called Christy Brown. It's a very innovative, young, street, luxurious brand. And I use the word luxurious street brand. That is counter to what fashion appears to be in the world. It's either luxury or street. She has been able to blend a bit about what she sees and imagines the future. She's taking traditional African prints, patterns, and techniques and putting them in buttons. You know, if you know African clothing, traditional clothing, we very rarely had buttons. Buttons were a European concept. So it's mix match. She's also looking at what is very influential in African culture, color. Africans generally are overly colorful. It is what we see in our environment that reflects what we wear. She's also taken traditional African techniques like strips of cloth and rope. We traditionally weave items, baskets. She is reinterpreting it in fashion. And she's experimenting in ways that are not African. In other words, we would never, as Africans, take cloth and cut it up in strips and put it at the back of our bodies. It's not a technique for us. It's a very European technique to experiment in ways. If you look at how I am dressed, this is European. It is straightforward cut. But the African that I am always has African jewelry of some kind. When we talk about color, excitement, this is the future of Africa. It is very Afropolitan. It is African, it is European, it is American, it is also Japanese, Asian, and it is also very much about the city. I divert a bit and say, let's go explore what else is happening in design besides fashion. I was trained as an architect, so I have affinity to architecture. In architecture, I look at two designers who are beginning to look at what the notion of hybrid modernity is. Kunle Adeyemi is an architect that was trained in Nigeria, worked in the Netherlands, and has, over the last couple of years, begun to speculate about possibilities for African design and looking at traditional methods of architecture, whether in material, whether in influences, and changing what the perception of African slums are. He designed a floating school in Lagos. And what he did was say, let's take a slum in Lagos and let's explore the possibilities of a floating school. Let's look at what opportunities, rather than destroy the slum, let's reincorporate some elements of the old. This particular area in Lagos has been there for about 45 years. It's a fishing village. The whole idea is to create a school for people who don't come on land frequently. They live on the water side. So traditionally, if you see the slide from the slide you see on the right, that is a traditional floating city. What he has done is reincorporated some of those ideas and reinterpreted these ideas from a modern perspective, but also looking at old images. The notion of a house and a schoolhouse. The notion on, rather than building on stilts, which are unstable, why don't we float? You know, in other words, let's modernize. He's addressing urban development, he's addressing climate change, transportation. For me, this is exciting. Another designer, Joe Ado, is also of the same spirit. What he believes is that the future lies in a simple concept: innovation and native design. So he created the term innovative. And what he is doing is taking design, a little bit about the old, a little bit about context, a little bit about the new. In other words, you cannot design without being aware of the climate, culture, and spaces that you occupy. Whatever your ideas are, they have to be influenced by where you are, which is your context, what materials you have. So bamboo, for instance, is African. So if I'm going to create a bathroom, and if you know any history about Africa, we used to bathe outside by the waterfront near bamboo. So it's a little bit of romance, bringing the old into the new. Okay? We traditionally build mud houses. So his definition was, well, let's build it the old way using new material. It's not going to look pretty. If you look at the brick wall, it isn't pretty. It's not supposed to be. We're not looking for modern perfection. We're looking for traditional perfection, which is imperfect. So I asked the question for you, and the last question: what if African cities were the fashion capital of the world? What if we could imagine making 100 million people work in an industry that is the future of Africa? And finally, last question: what if African designers were the pioneers? The notion of the West always leading is no longer the center of the world. Africa is the future. Thank you.